What's up, everyone? This is PB, Peanut Butter. I am Peanut Butter. Pastor Ben, and I'm starting something new. I am going to be walking through the Old Testament, and this is going to be a little different than what people like the Bible Project do, or maybe your weekly devotional does. I'm going to try to go a little bit more in depth with background things, with language, with culture, to sort of draw out some interesting parts about these stories and to kind of ask questions that I might not necessarily have the answer to, but it'll be interesting to do nonetheless. Because the Old Testament is something that a lot of Christians tend to avoid. I think because we're so separated from the culture that it's very difficult for us to understand some of the themes and some of the things going on. There is some content in the Old Testament that we're like, I don't really know what to do with. Like God's telling people to kill children. So what do you do with that? And then how do you wrestle with the concept of slavery, which seems to be supported by the Old Testament? So there's some morally curious ideas present there. So it makes it a little uncomfortable. But I actually want to just delve into it and talk about these things. So you can't really do that without actually doing it. So I'm just going to start from the very beginning, which is Genesis. So this is going to be sort of an introduction to the book of Genesis. I'll get into the actual content of it in following episodes. But what I'm going to do is with every book, I'm just going to start off with an introduction and then start working through it. And this is kind of what I'm doing with my small group right now, actually. We are reading through the Old Testament chronologically, moving story by story. And right now we're in the book of Judges. And I thought, you know what? I should just go back and just make some videos about this because it's led to some very interesting discussions. I've learned a lot myself. And so I think this would be helpful for people to do, is just take an honest look at the Old Testament, be able to ask difficult questions, not necessarily being presented with the easy answers, and just being honest about it. So, the book of Genesis. So, the book of Genesis, like its name suggests, is a book of beginnings. So, the actual title of the book of Genesis is Barashit in Hebrew, which means in beginning, which in itself is pretty interesting, but we'll get into that later because there's some linguistic stuff happening there that's actually very fascinating. But uh, the naming mechanism for the early books of the Old Testament are actually based on just the first word of the book. So the beginning of Genesis starts off with the word Barashit. So the whole book is called Barashit, in beginning. But that's actually kind of the theme of the book of Genesis. Is it is a story of beginnings. It talks about the origins of the lineage of the Hebrew people. It talks about the origins of creation and also not just the Hebrew people, but other people groups as well, and where they come from, how we get different languages, how the world is as it is. So it's a book about beginnings. And that being said, many of the characters and stories in the book of Genesis are constantly referenced by the rest of scripture. And not just the Old Testament that references back to Genesis and the figures there, but also the New Testament constantly makes references back to the book of Genesis. Though I admit this is sort of a maybe a moot point because scripture is constantly referencing itself, and every book of the Bible has references to other books of the Bible. So maybe this isn't as powerful a point as maybe what it might seem on the surface. But regardless, it does set in motion the main themes, like I already said, of the rest of the Bible. So Genesis is a very important book that way. And giving a little bit more background, I want to talk a little bit about the authorship of the book of Genesis. So tradition holds that Moses was the author of the first five books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch or the Torah, depending on how you what do you want to call them, which are the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And some people hold that view, and I think that's fine. If you want to hold the view that Moses wrote the first five books of the Bible, hey, I'm not going to bash you for that. That's totally fine. But when you actually look closely at the book, you can kind of tell that there's more than one author. And while Moses might have been one of the authors, or at least one of the main authors, or maybe even the redactor, which, okay, as an aside, there's something called redaction criticism in biblical studies, and a redaction is basically when someone takes multiple stories or just one story, and as they're copying it down for current and future readers, they sort of make some editorial changes. So Moses might have been a redactor of the first five books of the Bible, but we're talking about Genesis. So Moses might have been a redactor of Genesis, which was taking multiple traditions, multiple stories, and putting them together and maybe offering some of his own thoughts and reflections. And I'm not saying that to discount the value of Genesis, but it is very clear to scholars that there's different voices that are speaking throughout the book of Genesis. Like you have, for example, you have two different creation narratives that are written very differently. They actually use slightly different language. So it seems very unlikely that one person wrote Genesis 1 and 2. It seems like different people wrote both. You also have differences in like within the same account. So, for example, you have in the flood account in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, you have instances where two verses right next to each other contradict what they say. And then you also have a repeating of the story that happens throughout that seems very odd and very clunky when you read through it. And it seems very evident that that is an instance where you have someone taking two different stories and putting them together, and that is essentially redaction criticism. That's what redaction criticism looks at, is those instances, and you do have that throughout the book of Genesis, which seems to suggest that Genesis has more than one author. And again, I'm not saying that to criticize the book of Genesis. Obviously, I'm a pastor myself. I believe in the authority of scripture, but I'm also a biblical scholar. Like my background is in biblical studies, so I've, done a lot of studying with this stuff, and I don't see how believing that Genesis was written by more than one person delegitimizes what Genesis teaches. I think it should affect how we read the book of Genesis, but I don't think it devalues the authority of Genesis. And that being said, I do want to add one other thing, which is that uh, Genesis is not the only reference point for the stories that are told in Genesis. So, for example, if you've ever read the works of Josephus, he actually writes down several oral traditions of the Jewish people, and many of those stories are a part of the Genesis narrative. So, for example, in the works of Josephus, you have stories which again are the oral traditions of the Jewish people that talk about Abraham. Back when he was named just Abram, he was an idol maker. So he would carve idols that were representative of pagan gods, and through sort of an interaction with the cosmos, he begins to believe in a single deity known as God, and that's when God speaks to him and calls him to leave his people and go to the promised land. But that story is not mentioned in the book of Genesis itself. It's just an oral tradition. The interesting part about that, though, is that in the book of Joshua, specifically Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, Joshua mentions that Abraham and his family worshiped foreign gods. But that's not mentioned in the book of Genesis. The way the story in Genesis goes with Abram is with his family in this place called Haran, and then God calls him to leave there and go somewhere else. There's no mention that his family worshiped other gods. There's no mention of Abram being an idol maker, nothing like that. But you can tell, even in the book of Joshua, that there are other stories circulating within the community that are not present in the book of Genesis. And so you do have these parallel accounts of the stories of Genesis and the oral traditions. And you really shouldn't disregard the oral traditions. They do offer some insight, though I would say they don't have the same level of authority as what the book of Genesis has, but they do offer some very interesting background into the story. And in some cases, they actually help make a lot of sense out of the confusing parts of the Old Testament. So someone might ask, okay, so you have the stories written down in the book of Genesis. You also have these extra biblical accounts, such as the works of Josephus, that seem to talk about the same events as the book of Genesis. So why don't we have the works of Josephus in the Bible? Like, why is that not included in the biblical canon? And for that, I want to reference a podcast Jordan and I did on biblical inspiration, but also on the history of the Bible and how it came to be. So I'll link those in the description. You can also find them here, and that will answer that question. I'm not going to explain it here because it would take forever. But also, if you are looking more into how the Bible came together, there is something that we didn't mention in those podcasts, which is how the Old Testament came together. A lot of people understand fairly well the history of the New Testament. The Old Testament is a lot more nebulous. There's a lot of questions behind how the Old Testament came to be, and also when was the Old Testament codified? Like, when was it canonized? Like, when did the Old Testament become the collection of the Old Testament, given that you have extra biblical works? And for that, I would recommend David Carr's book, Writing on the Tablet of the Heart. And to summarize what he talks about there, no one really knows when that happened, but it happened sometime before the time of Christ, where the Old Testament became a collection of specific works that were referenced as authoritative. We don't really know why they're authoritative or how they came to be, like what the process was. Like, was there a council that decided that? Was there an individual who decided that? Yeah, no one really knows. So there you go. So I guess to summarize, I don't know why the works of Josephus are not considered canon, because they are the oral traditions of the Jewish people that go back to the same time and the same events that are referenced in the book of Genesis. And that leads me into the next part about when we're studying the book of Genesis, which is you really can't separate the book of Genesis from its setting in the ancient Near East. And I don't know why. Well, no, I do know why. It's fundamentalism. But there is a trend in within Christianity that wants to read every book of the Bible just on the surface, regardless of what the original context was. We have to read it through the lens of our current culture because it'll make the same amount of sense as it did to people who lived 3,000 years ago, which I guess makes sense to some people, but it doesn't make any sense to me. So you really have to understand the culture of the Old Testament, in this case, again, the book of Genesis, to really understand what Genesis is trying to say and to get a better feel for what the themes are and the different theological points that it makes that you really can't get to unless you understand the culture behind it. So, to talk a little bit about the culture of the ancient Near East, you have cultures that are panentheistic, not pantheistic, panentheistic, which essentially means that they believed that divine beings existed outside of sort of creation, but they also exist within creation. You have animism, which is uh, sort of a spiritualization of all created things. You have polytheism, which is a pretty easy concept, just a belief in multiple gods. You also have uh, cultures that are monolatristic, uh, or monolatrous, which is the idea that you believe in multiple gods, but there's one God that's supreme and you worship that one the most. And actually, throughout most of Israel's history, they were not monotheistic, they were monolatrous, which is just an interesting point to make because they did believe in other gods. And you see that with how they incorporate Canaanite practices and other pagan practices into their uh, religious lives, but they still believe that there is one God, Yahweh, that was greater than all of them. And that is not monotheism, that is monolatry. So it's a fun little fact for you. You also have in the ancient Near East different uh, mythologies regarding creation and how everything came to be. And they're actually very closely related. For example, the cosmology of the ancient Near East, you see this present throughout all different cultures. Essentially, the world is a landmass that rests upon these giant pillars, and you have, the mountain sort of hold up the ceiling, and the world exists within this bubble that is surrounded by these ancient primordial waters. And then outside of that, you have the heaven of heavens, which is where the gods lived. And this view was present throughout all of the ancient Near East. It's actually fairly similar to ancient Roman cosmology. Although I would say that there is a difference. In Roman cosmology, it's more three-dimensional. They did believe that the Earth was a sphere, and then the layers of creation kind of ripple out from that. Like you have, the space where you have the planets and the sun, then you have the space where the stars exist, and then you have the space, after that, and then after that, and after that. Whereas the ancient Near East was more two-dimensional. They believed that the Earth was a flat disk, and then all the layers sort of go up and then they go down. So there is a difference there. And when you read the creation narrative, you really get a sense of the ancient Near Eastern view of cosmology. And you really should not divorce the creation accounts from that view, because it actually creates very interesting theological points that the opening chapters of Genesis are making that you don't get if you just totally ignore the historical context of the book of Genesis. So it's very important to study and to know what the ancient Near East was like and what their beliefs were. And if you want a really good reference for that, I recommend a video by Christine Hale. She is a teacher, or she's a teacher at Yale. You can find her Yale course on the Old Testament on YouTube. And actually, it was her course that made me fall in love with the Old Testament. I just love how she teaches. I can tell she's very passionate about the subject. She's very knowledgeable about the subject, and I just ate it up. I went through the whole course in like a week. I just absolutely loved it. So I would highly recommend that you check that out if you want to know a little bit more, get a little bit more of a scholarly and well-researched examination of the Old Testament. But if you want something a little more simplified, then I would recommend the Bible Project. They do a pretty good summary of the themes in Genesis, and I'll link that video too. Although I would say that it is a summary, and so they do skip over a lot of details, which are things that I'm going to be exploring throughout this series, which is getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty. I'll probably go off on a lot of tangents, which that's just my personality. If that's your thing, then you'll probably enjoy it. But if that's not your thing, then you might not enjoy it. But regardless. And there was one more thing I wanted to bring up before I tie this off, because really all I'm doing is just giving a broad summary of the book of Genesis and pointing out some things that we need to keep in mind when we're studying the book. But you really can't talk about Genesis without talking about the controversy, which is the opening chapters of Genesis. Now, frankly, I think it's pretty sad and a bit pathetic that the opening chapters of Genesis are controversial. And you have people who believe that creation happened within 6 24-hour days, like literal 6-day creation theory. So it's just, reading the book of Genesis on the surface. And so, there's no other interpretation. On the other hand, you have people who believe that Genesis 1 and 2, the creation narratives, are totally mythological. They're nothing more than superstition and oral traditions. And so you really can't take them very seriously. And you have everything in between. And that's within Christianity. That's not outside Christianity. And that being said, I do find it fascinating that people outside of Christianity assume that if you're a Christian, then you believe that, you know, everything was created within 6 days. Sometimes it's pretty comical. Like some people have said to me, "Oh, then you must not believe in science because you're a Christian." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" They're like, "Well, you believe that everything was created in 6 days." And I'm like, actually, I don't believe that. If you want my personal view on how I interpret Genesis chapters 1 and 2, I recommend a lecture that was given by John Lennox on the subject, sort of summarizing his book, 6 Days That Divide the World. He does a very good job. Personally, I'm a theistic evolutionist, so that tends to be more where I line up. And also, there's a pretty funny clip in a debate between Peter Hitchens and Christopher Hitchens, where someone in the audience gets up and asks Peter, who is a Christian, essentially, he tries to ask him, do you actually believe in science, referencing creation? And Peter just has no idea what the guy's talking about.
When you walk into a natural history museum and you look up at a Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil, how does that relate to your religious belief? how do you place that in your religious belief? And your answer, I think, is it'll speak volumes about.
I'm not sure how it's supposed to. You'll have
Well,
to explain. Is there something
if you
I
hold a
should think about?
fossil in your if you hold a fossil in your hand, or if you look at a fossil in a natural history museum, you're a believer. Obviously, those two things have to come together in some way in your mind. How do they?
I'm sorry, I really don't know what you're driving at. I just don't.
Because the guy in the audience is assuming that because he's a Christian, he denies evolution and he denies, a creation period of like 13 billion years up to this point, or 14 billion years up to this point. But Peter doesn't hold a view of literal 6-day creation, and so he's not understanding the guy's question. So it's just, yeah, it's pretty funny. But then you have some interesting people like Ken Ham, for example, who not only believe in a 6-day period of creation, like a 6 literal day period of creation, but he also holds that if you don't believe in 6-day creation, then you are denying everything in Scripture. And he has a pretty interesting view. I know a lot of people are familiar with Ken Ham, given his debate with Bill Nye, which was such a mess. Like, I watched that debate, and man, it was pretty entertaining, though, not gonna lie, but it was bad. And that being said, I do want to say that if you are curious about where I'm getting that information on Ken Ham's view of creation, I recommend his book Gospel Reset, because that's essentially what he says here. Um, and that pretty much summarizes Ken Ham's entire theology. Like, I'm not gonna lie. I'm also planning on reviewing all of his books. Well, I shouldn't say all of them, but a pretty good mix of them. We have Gospel Reset, Already Gone, Already Compromised, and Ready to Return. And I'm looking forward to reviewing these. And I assume they're going to be pretty easy reads because Ken Ham's theology is very simplistic. And I already know what these books are about, and I haven't even opened them yet. Uh, but I do want to talk about Ken Ham because his views tend to be what is assumed every Christian believes by non-Christians. So I do want to touch on that. And he talks about the best way to reach young adults, which I vehemently disagree with his position on that. So I do want to review his books. So that is a thing that is coming. But anyways, I did want to reference him because he does tend to be a dominant voice in the conversation of creation. And because we're going to be talking about Genesis, that's going to be the first thing we're going to talk about is creation. So I thought I'd just reference him. But just to give you an idea, I do not agree with Ken Ham. So don't come into the series expecting that I'm going to talk about his perspective. Although, to be fair, I will recommend a video. It's called Is Genesis History? And they take an approach to creation as a literal 6-day thing. They offer some explanation on how that could happen. And I do find that to be a very interesting video. I don't agree with everything that it says, but I do recommend watching it. Even if you totally disagree with literal 6-day creation, I do find that video to be a good summary of what that position is, the various claims that it makes, and how people reach that conclusion. So I do recommend that video. And there are some things in it that I do agree with. For example, the guy who talks about how brains are structured and sort of the genetic leaps that have to happen in order for you to get to a human. I found that portion of the video very fascinating, very interesting and insightful. So I'll leave a link to that as well. Definitely check that book out. All right. So summarizing the book of Genesis before we get into it, Genesis was not written in a vacuum. There are social, there are linguistic, there are cultural things happening in the background that carry heavy influence over how and why the book of Genesis was written. And I would say it's actually very dangerous to read the book of Genesis just on the surface level and to develop theological and thematic conclusions based on just reading it on the surface. And I know some people might say, well, God wrote it, so therefore we can read it on the surface. And for that, again, I will reference an earlier podcast that Jordan and I did talking about biblical inspiration and why that's maybe a bad idea to take that position. But also, Genesis is a very important book. It sets the stage for the rest of Scripture. It establishes the themes, and it also establishes the trajectory that the rest of the Bible takes. And frankly, it's a very important book that is unfortunately taken for granted. Again, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning, because some of the concepts can be very confusing. It's not always clear what the morality is, because there's instances where you're like, okay, is this an example of what people should do or what they shouldn't do? Like, there's some morally gray areas that are happening throughout the book of Genesis. So it's hard to navigate those. And it seems like it would be much easier just to ignore the book of Genesis and just move on from there. But it is a very important book, which is why we're going to be looking at it. And so next time we will look at Genesis 1 and 2, which are the creation narratives of the book of Genesis. And if there's anything that you would like to know, if you have any questions about the book of Genesis, leave a comment down below or reach out on Facebook, Instagram, email. All those links are in the description. Because if you have a question about the book of Genesis, I would love to address it and approach it. And I absolutely love it when people ask questions about the Bible because it forces me to think of things and to ask questions myself. It forces me to do a little bit more research. And I always end up learning more because of it. So please bring on whatever questions you have. I would love to hear what you have to say about it. And let me know your thoughts as well down below. Do you agree with some of the claims that I make? Do you think that some of the things I'm talking about are a bit problematic? And what are your views on Genesis? Do you think it's a useful book? Do you think it's outdated? Should we just disregard it, as well as the whole Old Testament? Like, should we just throw all this out the window? Let me know down below. Leave a like. Be sure to subscribe for more content and share this with all your friends. It would really help us out. And I will see you next time.